One might say that all of Scripture, from the very beginning to the very end, is a story or a series of stories about humanity, about all of us, reaching out, pining to be made whole, searching and seeking for God's presence in every corner and facet of our lives. Each of these stories tells us of brokenness, and then on the flip side shows us where God shows up. Occasionally, we even hear stories of people getting new life, new starts, new chances. Over and over and over again, I think it tells us that God is bringing order out of the chaos. God is bringing healing to places of pain. God shows up where we most need God. God brings the wholeness, what we might even call shalom, to all of creation in every corner that we find it. Each of us is a story. We are the stories of our lives. Sometimes we almost tend to find ourselves in that story where we're not the actor, that the story is happening to us, that we are victims of what happens around us. We lose ourselves in that story. And so we sit back. We dwell in the brokenness. We become a part of the brokenness. We become defined by brokenness. And yet we pine. I'd like to take time today for us to meet someone that we very often overlook in Scripture. His name is Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus, we learn, is blind. He is healed, and then he seems to go missing. That's the story we're about to hear. Bartimaeus' story comes to us out of Mark's version of the Gospel. It's in his 10th chapter, and it's called The Healing of Blind Bartimaeus. I would argue that it could be argued, at least, in Mark's Gospel that this may be the only perfect disciple in the entire book. Mark has a tendency to beat up on and pick on the disciples. But this is a story that we need to hear. They, meaning the disciples and Jesus, they came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up. He is calling you." So, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, he regained his sight and followed him on the way. We never hear about Bartimaeus again. He seemingly just vanishes into thin air. But there are clues. There are clues right here in this story that show us something else. You see, if we ask, where does he go? Well, it tells us he goes to follow Jesus on the way. The earliest Christians, before we were called Christians, were simply called followers of the way. It was sometimes Nazarenes or Nazarites, but followers of the way was one of the earliest ways that people pointed out and talked about what would become the Christian movement. Bartimaeus, we're told, is healed and immediately gets up and follows Jesus on the way. Every step, every encounter that Bartimaeus has now has a new purpose. He seemingly disappears into the way, this stream of being, of following Jesus, of throwing off our identity, throwing off, in fact, and losing all that we thought we were. You see, Bartimaeus had been defined by what he wasn't. He was a beggar. He was blind. He was a beggar because he did not have what he needed. He was blind. He had no sight. He had been defined in terms of being marginalized, of being pushed to the outside. And here he is crying out for Jesus. Jesus, help me. Very much in the same way that in all of the entire Bible, we have story after story after story of people reaching out and crying out to God, pining to be made whole. Bartimaeus is just like everyone else, crying out to be made whole. And when he receives his sight, he has a brand new identity. But instead of his story now being told as some great disciple that goes off and accomplishes big things and yay, Bartimaeus, and it's all about him, instead we see just the opposite. We see him living out, in fact, what Jesus over and over and over again in Scripture tells us to be and do, which is we have to lose ourselves. Bartimaeus' entire identity seems to disappear in the blink of an eye, and we simply hear that he follows Jesus on the way. He's achieved the kind of wholeness that we hear about in Scripture called shalom. This amazing word that is so much more than simply being about being complete or peaceful or whole. It is the wholeness of being perfectly wrapped up and in union with the very divine being. It is perfection. And in achieving this moment of being made whole by Jesus, there's simply nothing left. There's nothing left for him to gain. There's nothing left for him to do. And so we hear him follow Jesus on the way. I would love to have walked along the way with him, of observing how every single step, every single encounter that Bartimaeus now has with people along the way, his life becomes an offering for theirs. His story becomes a story of hope, of possible new life for them, that the same desires they have, the same want and need for wholeness can in fact be found. Because here's a man who had nothing and gained everything. Bartimaeus goes along the way following Jesus. He meets people in all walks of life, and in every one of them, having found this wholeness, he starts a new path in his life, becoming a part of other people's stories. Here at the Presbyterian Church in Westfield, we like to think that the way in which we live our lives as a church, I mean as a whole community, is that we have encounters. They can be Bible studies, they can be worship services like this. They can be meetings in pods or house church even. But opportunities all through the life of our congregation and the people that we come across, encounter after encounter after encounter with the holy. And something happens when we encounter the divine. Something sparks inside of us that sets us on a brand new path in our lives that leads to utter transformation. Bartimaeus is a story of exactly that. There was nothing else that needed to be told, because once he started down that path, his story was no longer about him. It was about the way in which his life brought life for other people. I think the question as we start this new series of hearing the untold stories is a very simple one. What story is your life writing? What is the story that is being unfolded before you in your life? Not as someone who is passive and is simply receiving what is taking place. But what is the story being written by your life? How is your life interacting in every single encounter with other people? How is your life leaving a mark in the lives of others? Bartimaeus invites us on a journey to follow Jesus on the way, to lose ourselves and receive everything, receive wholeness, and for our lives to now become a part of the lives of others.